Europe, 1000 AD, 1000 contemporary era. Rome is finished. The barbarians have destroyed Rome. From the south, the Vandals. From the north, the Langobards, and Goths everywhere. Basically, the Romans, the Roman population have disappeared. They were brown people with curly hair, like Egyptians, because they had originated from the east. They were massacred by the Germanic people. So now we have Viking kingdoms who have dominated the Saxons. So we have this mixture of Saxons and Vikings fighting each other. They have no history. They have no writing. They have no memory. It's just war. 500 years of war with Rome and 500 years of war amongst themselves. 1,000 years of non-stop war. And then something happens. A pope decides, enough is enough. I have to do something. So he tells all these barbaric tribes, you will go to heaven. All your debts will be forgiven. All your crimes will be forgiven. Go to the Holy Land in the name of Christ, in the name of God, in the name of Catholicism. And so all these barbarians who had never ever heard of the Holy Land, Jerusalem, whatever, there was no mention of Holy Land. The Jewish people who say it was their Holy Land 1,000 years ago were expelled by the Romans. The people living here in the Middle East were a hodgepodge of all kinds of tribes, and these barbarians came, whoa, Holy Land in the name of Christ, and committed atrocities for 200 years in the name of Christ. A group of them got familiar with the Eastern culture and became the Templars. They learned about trade. They learned about mysticism, about energy, about transmutation. They learned a lot. They had access to Oriental books. Alexandria was still very powerful. They had trade with Constantinople, and Alexandria and Constantinople were the two outposts of China, Persia, and India, which were the three centers of culture and civilization and trade. So these Templars started becoming more sophisticated, and they realized that living amongst the barbarians was dangerous. But they prospered, bringing Oriental products to the West. It was the basis of Freemasonry, the lodges. Lodge means shop, loggia. They had their retail shops where they brought things from the Orient and sold them. And the Germanic counts and barons were barbarians, had never seen luxury products. Ivory. The Romans had bought many luxury products from India, but that was 1,000 years ago. No one remembered anymore. Now the Europeans were getting familiar with silk, perfume, opium, hair from India, cotton, all kinds of sophisticated products. And the Templars, as the entrepreneurs, the middlemen, made a lot of money and became rich. They started lending money. Now, during the last few centuries, there had been many massacres of Jews for lending money, because the Catholic Church had forbidden for Christians to deal with money. It was the work of the devil. Games, playing cards, all of this was the work of the devil. So everybody could stay totally barbaric and have no education. At that time in Europe, no one knew how to read and write. And the Catholic Church was a little bit more sophisticated than the barbarians. And they were always trying to convince them through rhetoric, through the communication that they had, which was at a higher level than the barbarians, Vikings, and Goths. However, the King of France and the King of England were in debt to the Templars and the church too. So that they decided on Friday the 13th to exterminate the Templars. And they arrested them and burnt them and forced confessions that they dealt with the devil, that they were devil worshippers. So that was the end of a little bit of sophistication in Europe. And then it was back to killing each other. 100 years of war between France and England, and horrors, non-stop horrors. By that time, the Middle East was controlled by the Turks, the Seljuk Turks of Saladin, and then the Mamluk Turks of Crimea. And the Mamluk Turks expelled the Crusaders out of the so-called Holy Land. So we had more than 10 crusades over 500 years, and it was a total disaster, because even after the Crusaders were expelled, they tried in vain to invade Egypt and invade Jerusalem and Constantinople. They were pirates, and this is what pirates do. They're looking for gold and easy life. By that time, the Ottoman Turks had invaded Eastern Europe and created a tremendous civilization. So it was back to Les Miserables, misery. The Turks, the Ottoman Turks, the Mamluk Turks. And Europe had another nightmare, because before the Ottoman Turks, the Mongols had invaded Eastern Europe. Genghis Khan and the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Horde. So the Mongols had devastated Eastern Europe and were in control of Eastern Europe. And the Ottoman Turks were running away from the Mongols. So we had Genghis Khan, we had Tamerlane, we had the Ottoman Turks, we had the Mamluks controlling the Mediterranean. Europe was suffering. And they created this concept that the rest of the world are demons. Our world is, we are good people. So they developed a culture of appropriation. They started appropriating Roman civilization as their own, Greek civilization as their own. They had nothing to do. The Vikings and the Germanic people had nothing to do with Rome and Greece, but they appropriated to put themselves up on a higher scale. Our culture is Roman, Greco-Roman. We are Christians, although almost none of them had an idea of what Christianity was about 2,000 years ago, or even spoke Latin. And the Bible that was presented to them was the Vulgata, which was a badly translated Bible. So by the time we have the 14th, 15th, 16th century, Constantinople has crashed. It is a nightmare in Europe. And then 300,000 Iranian immigrants are allowed into Italy by the Pope. Civilized people. That is why a lot of Italian genetics is from Iran, the Indo-Iranians. First they escaped from Tamerlane and asked asylum in Byzantium. And when Byzantium collapsed to the Ottoman Turks, the enemies of the Indo-Iranians, they asked for permission from the Pope, and the Pope allowed them to return to Etruskia, the north of Italy, the central part of Italy, where their ancestors had migrated, the Indo-Europeans and Indo-Tocharians. So, three things the Europeans discovered. First, the so-called Roman order, the Pace Romana, the Roman peace, that if you keep fighting among yourselves, you end up nowhere, which is what is happening in the Middle East. They decided that it was time for trade, especially in the Baltic regions. So they started trading. And one of these trading groups, the Protestants of Holland, the Dutch people, decided no more inquisitions, no more massacre of Jews, no more massacre of Freemasons, Templars. Let's listen. Let's make money. Let's do business. So they got together a group of people, returned to India to do business. The Dutch East India Company, East India is Indonesia and India. Then the British East India Company. Then we had the French East India Company. They realized that if you want to be a part of civilization, you have to trade. And this is where you have all the prosperity. India, Southeast Asia, the southern part of China, and the eastern part of Africa. Non-stop riches and wealth. So, after about 100 years, 200 years of trading, the second terrible thing happened to the Europeans. They discovered the Americas. And they found out that there's a lot of gold and silver, but the people are very, very simple. They have no war concept. They're simple tribes. So, with the discovery of the Americas and with the discovery of Africa, they were able to get all the gold and silver, the African slaves and the African commodities, and they started getting rich. And one of the great French philosophers, Claude Lévi-Strauss, said this was the worst thing that could have happened to Europe because they got rich and they stayed stupid and lazy. And with this newfound wealth, they returned to India and started blowing up the Indian ports. And then they had a war in Southeast Asia and China. So, for 100 years, they were carving up Africa, the scramble for Africa. They were robbing and stealing the gold of the Aztecs and Incas. And they were colonizing the jewel of the crown, India. Why is it called the jewel of the crown? Because it was a land of riches. Cotton, opium, teas, all kinds of sapphires and rubies, and all kinds of products. However, this was at a price. Because if you want to dominate the world, you need soldiers. So you send all your young men to Australia, South Africa, overseas. You lose your colonies. They lost the United States. It became independent. Then they lost South Africa and Australia, and then India. And then now, you can't even see it on the map. It's back to insignificance. They had 200 years of traveling around the world, and they blew it by having war everywhere with everyone. And what is the situation of England today? People don't even know that around 100 years ago, they had 50 tons of Indian gold that they defaulted. 50 tons. Today it would be worth trillions of dollars. They defaulted, and they said that because of the First World War and Second World War, they will not pay India. The Indians lent them money 200 years ago, and they came back with guns and cannons. And so time goes by. What's 200 years? If you ask Indian people and Chinese people, it's nothing. They have been doing their trading for thousands of years. So it's back to the global south, BRICS plus, everybody's trading again. And these countries that dominated the world for 200 years with guns and cannons and war are basically returning to their situation thousands of years ago. They appropriated certain things. Gunpowder, wow, it came from China. They used it for guns. The gold that they stole from the Aztecs and Incas, they used it for guns. The African slaves that they stole to work on their plantations, they used the money for guns. And then half of the money was blown up with the 300 years of war with pirates. And then the 100-year wars between themselves. And all of this robbing and stealing led to non-stop war. And today, the population demographics, the demographic dynamics of Europe is that the countries are disappearing. They have less than 1% of population growth, in many cases much worse, because the young people are dying in the Ukraine war, are dying of drugs, and the marriages have ended, the families have ended, there are no more babies. Countries like Italy are disappearing. So 200 years of non-stop war is nothing to brag about. It's nothing to be proud about. What I'm trying to show here is the truth and reality of what happened. And there is another little story. The Japanese thought that war industry is good. So they copied the European imperialist model and started colonizing China, Philippines, Southeast Asia, and became warmongers. And we know what happened to Japan at the end of the Second World War. It was burnt and destroyed by 2 atomic bombs. They paid a heavy price for trying to copy the Europeans. So we have to be very careful when you are living in the corners of the world and have no idea of civilization and think you're great, that you're so smart, and you want to dominate people that you know nothing about. And I will say it again. If I know everything about you and you know nothing about me, one of us is going to lose very, very heavily. And there is something that people do not understand. The people of the Indian subcontinent are the most culturally sophisticated. They deal with Europeans, with Africans, with Southeast Asia, with Arabs, because they're at the center of the world. They learn languages, they speak English, they deal in technology, in science, and especially trade, and they have good behavior, so everybody wants to do business with them. It's called civilization. It's called civilization. People have to appreciate that. So one of the things that I try to help people understand is that the way forward is going back to the world of peace and prosperity, of good behavior. The last 200 years of Western European and Japanese experimentation of empire building and was a flop. And the last 100 years of American empire building being the greatest and the best, and that's a scam. They're going down just like the Europeans and Japanese went down. So, finalizing, there is a lesson that the global dynamics teaches everyone. First of all, we have to escape from the desert. We have to move to greenlands. But the people in the greenlands should accept these migrants and invest in them rather than humiliate them and treat them with racism, because the younger generation of these people will hate you. So the blacks and Latinos in the United States are not very interested in helping the American dream of controlling the world. And the children of immigrants in Europe are a fifth column, a problem for the Europeans. And then we have millions and millions and millions of militants, so-called terror groups that have been armed by the United States, by the Russians, by the Israelis, by the Europeans. And who's going to deal with them? There is another alternative. The BRICS Plus. Thank you for watching. Watch each of the videos so we understand the importance of the globe, learning through the globe, understanding diversity, understanding dynamics. Everything is shifting, the shifting sands of time, the shifting sands of the desert. The recession of the ice creates new space. The world is there. It doesn't belong to anybody. We should just get together and share it and add, multiply people's backgrounds, people's skills and knowledge. There should be less hate and more compassion. Thank you very, very much for watching, and subscribe so you can help us.